1 in 5 Gen Zers have 1 or 0 close friends, and that has tripled over the past decade. They're not just considered to be the most lonely generation right now, but potentially the most lonely generation in all of history.
Why did you disconnect from how you felt? Why did you disconnect from other people? Because part of refinding that again might be understanding, well, why did it happen in the first place?
Hello, it's Mental Health Awareness Week, and this year's theme is community and the positive benefits it can have on our mental health. With that in mind, we're speaking to a Priory expert today about that very topic. So joining me is Charlie Carroll, who's a therapist at the Priory Hospital in Altrincham. How are you doing, Charlie?
Yeah, I'm good.
Just to sort of frame the discussion, when I was doing a bit of research around this topic, saw a report from a think tank called Onward in 2024, and I wanted to frame the discussion a little bit around Generation Z and or Z or Z.
Gen Z.
Z's. That's the American way, isn't it?
Yeah, Z.
Okay. Anyway, we'll go with Z.
We'll go with Z.
Anyway, this report said 1 in 5 Gen Zers have 1 or 0 close friends, and that has tripled over the past decade. And they're not just considered to be the most lonely generation right now, but potentially the most lonely generation in all of history. And so I wanted to discuss, maybe it's the idea that we've lost some community aspects in our society, and Gen Z are sort of at the brunt of that. To start with, from your perspective as a therapist, why do you think that being social is good for our mental health?
Well, we've always been social. Since humans existed, we've been social. And so all of our, psychological and emotional infrastructure, our self-esteem, our sense of self is all innately connected to how we're perceived, at least for most of our life, right? I mean, it's not connected when you're a baby. You don't really care. And equally, usually when you're very, very old as well, you don't care that much either. But for most of our life, it's very connected. So, in order for your emotions and your thoughts and your needs to be met and for all of them to work together effectively for you, a degree of being able to connect with other people is, I'd argue, essential. I mean, it's one of the irreducible needs, you might say. So if you deprive somebody of it for any period of time, you're going to induce some kind of negative psychological reaction. And much in the same way that if I deprive someone of sleep, that will make them suffer. Equally, if I deprive someone of connection and contact with other people and the ability to be social, that's a very fast way to make someone very unwell. So that probably goes some way to show how important it is.
And then I think following on from the stat that Will gave at the beginning, do you think there's been, have recent societal changes impacted this to make us feel more disconnected? A lot of people work from home now. There was the pandemic, and the anxiety that comes with post-COVID for some people. Do you think any of that's impacted a loneliness in us?
Massively. I think probably not just the last 20 years. I'd probably say the foundations for it have been laid for a lot longer, to be honest. And it's a double-edged difficulty because there's disconnection between yourself and other people, or between people interpersonally, and then there's being disconnected from your own emotions and your own experience, right? And not knowing how you feel, not knowing what you believe, what your values are. And if I'm disconnected from myself, it's very hard to connect with you, because I don't know what I'm connecting, what's connecting,
Yeah.
And one of the biggest things in order to kind of get connection usually is authenticity, right? And that's why a lot of the time, places that have a lot of people are actually very disconnected, because people end up adopting personas and social identities, let's say, that then prevent them from actually being authentic, and then you're presenting something rather than being something. And so even if somebody does connect with what you're presenting, that's not necessarily you, because you're not being authentic anymore. And there's probably a variety of reasons for that, and it definitely leads to difficulties. I mean, there's a lot of discussion at the moment, and there's an increase in neurodivergency, particularly ADHD. And if you ask somebody with quite strong ADHD, what are they feeling? A lot of the time, the answer is, I don't know. it's quite hard to connect with that, and vice versa. Very difficult for them to connect with people sometimes because, they can't rest where their emotions are, understand what they feel, and then be able to communicate that. Again, their attention gets diverted and it doesn't occur.
Yeah. And then I think obviously we've given some examples of what can impact this, but the impact of social media, I imagine, is very similar to what you've said, but quite a big one. I mean, there's a study from Bournemouth University we've got here. So 288 young adults from the university said individuals who passively use social media tend to experience greater feelings of loneliness, which can subsequently lead to increased psychological distress. Is that something that you've seen or in the therapy room?
I guess that kind of environment on social media, which is, it isn't designed to optimize maintaining concentration for longer periods, right? And it's not designed to optimize reflection or, open communication, right? It's not designed to optimize any of those things. It's designed to optimize clicks, feedback, view counts, which is a very different driver. And, naturally, if people are developing and their brains are developing when they're using these things, that could be quite problematic because, oftentimes people will go on their phone with an original intention and then they'll get caught on social media and they'll forget entirely why they've even gone on their phone.
Yeah.
And so, you're connected with something that you need yourself. Maybe I need to find something out on the internet or whatever it may be. You're in a state of being connected to what you need in some sense. Then you go on your phone and you just get completely disconnected and you don't even know why you're on your phone anymore. But then think about that, not just in terms of, if you have something specific to do, but in terms of just your emotions all the time, just constantly just disconnecting from anything you feel. Because I don't feel what I feel anymore. I feel whatever I'm feeling because of this video.
Yeah.
So there's no individuality anymore, right? If you spend time by yourself, you really come to know what you feel without the influence of other people. Now, the problem is most of the time people are on their own now. They're not reflecting. They're not actually sat considering where they're at and what they're feeling or checking in. They're just disconnecting and they're still engaged in that socially derived engagement where you're then feeling as a consequence of stuff you're absorbing, not as a consequence of your own internal process, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think I'm always really conscious of not bashing social media so much all the time because, for start, this is going on YouTube. People are watching this on YouTube, so hypocrisy straight away. But I always think and just more broadly about the internet, before the internet, communities sort of made up of different people, and they all might have different beliefs, different ages, different genders. But the idea is that you're all sort of living within a common sort of space, and you all just have to learn to get along. And you might not agree on everything, but that's fine. And I sort of feel like these days, now we've got the internet, you can find your tribe wherever that might be.
Yeah.
So you can find a community that fits with you, and that's obviously a good thing because it might lead to you just feeling more fulfilled, or maybe you find that purpose in that community. But at the same time, I feel like we moved away from the idea of your local community is just full of people that might not be the same as you, but that's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and probably maybe there's a distinction there as well between identifying with and developing an adult identity, or a personality of your own. If I'm really into video games, I can obviously find my tribe online, and that's a really good thing because maybe I'm from a rural location, and there aren't those people around me, and that can be really healthy and good. I think one of the maybe more concerning aspects of things is that, a key component of that kind of real interpersonal community that you're describing, we maybe used to have more of, is that it's very good in terms of, I suppose, attachment, right? And the idea being that one of the big things that influences how well we connect with our emotions as adults is how well those around us connected with our emotions when we were very young, particularly between kind of 0 and 10 years. Now, if you rewind the clock, maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, it wasn't uncommon that essentially the child would stay with mother for, well, basically, as long as they could be carried, they were carried. Then if they got too big to be carried, mum usually carried the baby on her back. And this whole time, there's skin-to-skin contact, And then if the baby got too big to be on the back, the baby would go down onto the floor. Even then, though, still be holding mum's leg or something, usually till about 10 years old. And obviously that means mum's constantly there. Typically it'd be mum constantly would be there to attend to their emotions, validate their emotions, and connect them with how they feel and go, you're angry. That's okay, you're angry. I still love you even though you're angry. And so they stay connected to their emotion. Now, these days, we probably give, in terms of maternity and paternity leave, like a couple of months, and that's kind of it.
Yeah.
We wonder why everyone's running around disconnected from how they feel and disconnected from their emotions and lonely and unable to, really perceive what they're experiencing. And that's probably been happening for a while.
But so obviously there's lots of, like you said, like finding a tribe online. For example, I use a kind of a book tracking app so I can see how much I'm reading and kind of set goals and stuff. But within that, there's like virtual book clubs, and you just have chats and you can discuss, I've read this book, recommend it, blah, blah, just as you would if you went to, an in-person one, which is really good because you're talking to people, like you said, from, all over the country. But would that be enough by itself? Is that enough for us if I chose that instead of, I don't know, going out and seeing people?
It's definitely better than nothing, right?
Yeah.
Definitely better than nothing. And it can be very meaningful, and you hear these stories, don't you, of people who, I knew somebody and they passed away and they had no idea. Well, their parents were really sad when they passed away, and their parents had no idea that they had all these friends online, and all these messages came. And I remember going to the funeral, and there was a live stream obviously at the back, and all of like the online community were there as well, and that was really, really touching because they didn't have very good mobility, and so they were really limited in that sense, and that was really nice. Now I would probably caveat that with, I mean, this is one of these ballpark figures you get as a headline on a magazine, but maybe it's not this extreme, but they do say 90% of communication is nonverbal. If we were to translate that, we might say, if one of the purposes of emotions is to communicate how you feel, get in touch with how you feel and how other people feel in order to connect. If we were to translate that statistic, we could be saying, well, 90% of that we're missing out of if we're doing it online.
Yeah.
And, it's things like eye contact and things like personal proximity. When you step close to somebody, it's a very different type of, it's just more intimate than if it's online, if you're just in the proximity of other people. And that means you are more likely to communicate in a more meaningful way. It doesn't mean you can't do it online. It just means it may be a bit easier if you're in person.
I think that kind of leads on quite nicely of, we've got like these digital communities, but then, in terms of in person, it maybe feels like we don't have a lot of places that we can go and meet up with people that are free or at least cheap, so I think like third places, so the kind of public locations where they're inexpensive, they're not home, they're not work, they're just a nice middle ground where you can meet people, or at least people, with some kind of common interest, and it kind of, that can provide a sense of community.
Yeah, and I think I'll put the link to this article in the description, but I read an interesting article on HuffPost, and it was saying about Gen Z, and they're the first generation who have been like the chronically online generation. So I'm a millennial. I think you're both Gen Z. I represent the older generation in this chat, the forgotten generation. But I think, like Arabella was saying, this article is talking about third spaces, so like places that aren't your work or your home, where you can just go somewhere with your friends and sit there for free. Those places are like lesser and lesser. So I was on the tram. I filmed this in Manchester. I was on the tram the other day coming in, and there used to be like a green bit of grass next to a pub called The Wharf. It's a really nice pub. There's flats there now, and people used to sit there when the sun was out. Really good sun spot. So now that's gone, and now you have to go and sit in the pub. But then, these days you've got to spend £6.50 for a pint in Manchester. So all these things are like, it's almost like, I think a lot of Gen Z feel like they want these in-person spaces, but then they've got cost of living pressures, and so there aren't, this, again, it's that like sense of community is like being ebbed away a little bit in person.
And I suppose if you're in those spaces, it's a much slower pace, isn't it? It's a much slower pace of life when you're with other people in a space where, the primary purpose of what you're doing is to connect with and socialize with other people. Usually the pace is a lot slower than, whether if it's just you and your phone, if it's just you going about your day by yourself, if it's just you getting into the gym, getting to work, etc., etc. And people's ability to slow down that way is necessary for them to be able to even do that, you know. And I think sometimes people are so, you know, just the nature of life as it is today, you know, with the cost of living pressures, you know, everybody's time poor, aren't they? They're always trying to fit more in, always trying to do more. And, you know, that kind of higher paced approach to life doesn't bode well for these kind of activities, because you suddenly having to like really flip it and go, wait, hang on, I've got to kind of take my 9-item to-do list and park it for a few hours. I've got to kind of figure out where I'm at, and maybe I don't want to do that because maybe I don't actually feel that great. You know, suddenly it's like, well, maybe it's easier if I just don't do that and just crack on. And before you know it, you know, we don't have the people aren't doing it anymore.
It's funny you say that. I was talking to this before we started, but there was a piece in the I think it was in the Guardian, and it was talking about how many members of Gen Z go to the gym now. Obviously, that's a good thing. People are living more healthy lives than they were before. But in many ways, that's replacing the pub. And like you just mentioned there, there's this idea now that people have, even in their own time, in their free time, they've still got to be productive. And that's sort of like, actually, again, how we, you know, somewhere like the gym's quite individualized. It's about personal growth. Again, those can be good things, but actually, is that coming at a cost of, you know, just going and sitting in a communal space with your mates, with people who are other parts of your community, just for the sake of doing that? And actually, that's quite a nice environment. And again, we've sort of shifted as a society away from that in some ways a little bit, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I think it's quite good, isn't it? I was saying before this that I think in terms of like the gym, that's quite a nice aspect to have, that it can maybe ease some people's nerves or make them feel a bit more comfortable. But then obviously you could also like make like you and your friends go at the same time and stuff, and it's like you're already paying your membership, so it's essentially free.
Yeah,
it's already gone out the bank account. So I think like that's a really nice positive way to kind of interact and feel like you've spent your quality time with people, you've been around them, you had conversations, even if you've just spoken about your day and then put your headphones on, you know, for the rest of your session.
For sure.
I think like it makes a big difference, doesn't it? Definitely.
Again, in the therapy room, if someone like experiencing loneliness, or they sort of, again, they might have a feeling that they don't have a sense of community, do you ever, I know with GPs talk about social prescribing, don't we? Like, is that something that therapists do? Do you try and encourage people to get involved in local communities?
Yeah, you have kind of social activity scheduling might be something you look at. You know, usually there's hopefully quite a bit of thought into kind of how you're going to do that and how you're going to ensure that it isn't just being around people, you know, because sometimes you can be around people and still be very lonely and still feel very disconnected. But of course, you know, if you're around more people, there's more chance of you connecting with people. There's more chance of that actually happening. And so it's definitely not a bad place to start to go, well, if we are feeling lonely and disconnected, and particularly in kind of depression diagnoses, you'll often see that real kind of social withdrawal. And you see it with anxiety as well, to be fair. You know, it's not a bad idea to have a go at ratcheting that up a little bit and seeing how that impacts things. And then even if it doesn't necessarily get the results you want, you know, say you do increase social activity a lot, you know, you still have a bit of a base from which to move, because you could then go, right, okay, well, we've tried these things. It's not necessarily lining up the way we want. Well, why? You know, how do you feel in these environments? Do you feel like you're able to be yourself? Why don't you feel like you're able to be yourself? Oh, okay, so these activities don't line up with you as well. Maybe you're with people who have different values and interests to you, so then you don't feel as though you can be as open around them. And so then you can start again sort of adjusting things thereafter to hopefully get to a place where somebody can, you know, have a fulfilling social life and reap all the rewards for their mental health, you know.
In terms of social prescribing, would that ever delve into the digital side of it, or would that kind of always be like, you know, go to join these in-person communities and clubs, or, you know, does it ever delve into looking online?
Certainly. I mean, obviously in what I do, CBT, there's a whole host of different things, but one of them's a kind of activity menu, and it just lists loads of like different possible social activities if that's an area that you're targeting. And obviously nowadays a lot of them are online, you know. It's like some of it's in person, like, you know, join a political party, join a book club, you know. But some of it will be like join an online dating app, you know. And that's just the norm now, isn't it? And so, you know, but I think I'd always be looking to have some in-person stuff. And I think, again, if the online is kind of a key to open the door of more meaningful connection in person as well, then that's so, you know, that makes sense, doesn't it, as well, I suppose. Yeah.
Definitely. And then moving on from social prescribing is, you know, what other tips would you give from the therapy room for someone who's like experiencing loneliness?
You know, I think it's really being able to express accurately what you're experiencing and feeling to somebody else. And, you know, a lot of the time people who feel very lonely don't feel kind of seen, or they don't feel heard or understood. Or maybe they have been authentic and it's kind of scarred them, right? They've been honest with somebody. They've really, I guess, put their heart on their sleeve a bit and it hasn't worked for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And then as a reaction, they then disconnect from everything and just disconnect from others and disconnect from how they feel. And then wind up very lonely. And I think it's really kind of understanding, well, why did you disconnect from how you felt? You know, why did you disconnect from other people? Because part of refinding that again might be understanding, well, why did it happen in the first place? You know, why did we disconnect slightly? And it could just be circumstantial. It could just be like, you know, I moved and, you know, I had a couple of social interactions and they didn't go well. And then before I knew it, I was in a new place and I didn't know anyone, you know, and it's like, that's, you know, makes sense, doesn't it? And, you know, and that can knock someone's confidence and, you know, and again, an understanding, well, okay, so then we've maybe learned to believe that, you know, we're not a likable person because we've had these few social interactions that didn't go our way. And that wouldn't necessarily be accurate if we expand the time horizon. So maybe we just need to get some new evidence from new social interactions to kind of change that belief about yourself that you're not likable, right? And so, you know, again, it depends on the context per se. But yeah, I certainly think that, you know, trying to kind of express authentically and accurately what we're feeling, potentially anchoring, you know, potentially leveraging a bit of social prescribing, understanding why the loneliness occurred in the first place. Was it circumstantial, or was it more that something happened outside of you and then something happened inside of you as a result, right? Because that's usually what happens, right? You know, maybe you move location, but, you know, that wouldn't necessarily make someone lonely. But, well, what happened inside of you because you moved?
Yeah.
Oh, well, you know, you had a few social interactions that didn't work, etc., etc. And then you believed these things about yourself. And then the way to cope with that was to isolate yourself and etc., etc.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, then please give it a like. It helps us to spread this message and get this content out there to the people who need to see it. And if you want more videos like this from Priory, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks.